Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company, a nationally ranked community-focused bank with over 30 locations throughout Virginia, Northeast Tennessee, and North Carolina. Who you choose to bank with can make all the difference. Visit firstbank.com to learn more. What's going on, Hokies fans? We're officially 9 days away from kickoff down in Nashville for Virginia Tech football, and you know what that means. It means our previews of the 2024 Virginia Tech football team roll on here in Blacksburg. We're talking all things defense today. We got our lunch pail mentality ready to roll. The entire football crew is on set. It's episode 369 of the Tech Sideline podcast, and it starts right now. We record on Thursday, August 22nd, 2024, from our high-tech studio at the Virginia Tech Corporate Research Center. Remember to like, subscribe, refer the show to a friend, and head over to techsideline.com to check out our extensive editorial content. As always, the first month of your subscription is free, and students are free as well. Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company, and I should note that we have our good friend, Jim McAllister, who retired from First Bank and Trust Company as general manager and is responsible for hooking TSL up with this awesome sponsorship. He's sitting in. He's watching today's podcast offset. So, Jim, welcome in. So glad to have you. The TSL podcast is also sponsored by the Hokie Way, whose countdown to kickoff campaign is underway all this month. This is a huge campaign for the Hokie Way that generated over $500,000 in NIL funds last year. We'll be featuring updates on the campaign all month long, so check out Tech Sideline to find out how you can donate. We'll also drop a link in the YouTube description, so be on the lookout for that as well. I'm your host, Giovanni Heater. To my right, Chris Coleman, our lead analyst and columnist. Across the way, Andy Bitter, our senior staff writer. And in the fourth chair, our managing editor, David Cunningham. Nick Brown is behind the scenes producing the show, as always, the mustache man. And of course, Jim McAllister from First Bank and Trust Company is in the house. All right, gentlemen, before we get into the defensive conversation here, I want to ask you guys, you're coming off the heels of the last practice that you get to see yesterday before we kick things off 9 days from now down in Nashville. I want you each to give me one thing that stood out to you throughout this entire fall camp. We'll start with Chris.
I think it was more physical. We didn't get to see a lot. We really only got to see one session where they were really going at it. But even in some of their smaller drills, I noticed an increase in physicality this year. Some of that, I think, is due to the fact that they have to be more physical this year against the better teams they play, because they were not last year. So I think there's more of a focus on it, and maybe they're a little hungrier this year. But I also think some of that is just, it's the third year in this strength and conditioning program, so everybody's a year bigger, stronger, and faster. And it's an older team. It's a bunch of juniors and seniors, so you would expect a more physical style of play. So I think this year's team is going to be more physical. That's my overall takeaway.
That's how you win in the trenches, Andy.
I think it was the lack of drama. It was pretty quiet camp, and I think that's related to fewer than a handful of jobs that were really up for grabs. I mean, normally we're writing about the quarterback, who's going to be the starting quarterback midway through August. That's like an annual tradition in Blacksburg. And this year, Drones was the guy, and, Price sort of, let it out yesterday that Schlee's the backup. It wasn't this big fanfare thing. So, I think the position's up for grabs. One of the safety spots, the will linebacker, the interior offensive line, that's about it. I mean, normally you go into camp and there's, 7 or 8 or 9 spots. Like, these two guys are still battling it out. We'll see who starts in the opener. I think they kind of knew what they were, and that's, based on all the retention from last year, the experience they have on the roster. And, if you're a head coach or coach on this team, that's probably a pretty comforting thing to know exactly kind of what you have going into the season.
How about you, David?
It's evident there's more depth. Watching like a group like the wide receivers practice, and it just cycling through. Even though Stephen Gosnell was in blue for much of camp, I mean, he's a guy that will factor into that room. There's just so much talent, especially on the defensive line too. I was watching those guys yesterday, and it doesn't really matter who's with the ones or the twos, or in some cases even the threes, because they have so many guys that will end up rotating in and factoring in at some point. And that's a good problem for J.C. Price and Fontel Mines to have. And I think it's credit to both those guys, especially Fontel Mines. We've talked about this before, how quickly or how he was able to flip over that room so fast from a couple years ago where Caleb Smith was kind of the only option in that room to the fact that he's now going to have to figure out who he can't play. I think the depth has stood out to me the most. Even on the offensive line, and I think yesterday, which is something we'll talk about soon, with them announcing like Laith Ganem is probably going to potentially be in that starting role. I think it's evident that there's more depth on the offensive line as well, which is something Virginia Tech didn't have last year.
When was it, do you think, the flip, kind of switch to going from camp to game prep mode and get ready for Vanderbilt?
Earlier than normal. They were running some scout team stuff for Vanderbilt yesterday, and technically game week hasn't even started yet. So it wouldn't shock me if they started putting in a few things last week. And you can do that with an experienced team. When you've got a bunch of juniors and seniors and, almost everybody knows the system, everybody's been through this before. What in the past might have taken a week to install, you can probably do it in a day or two now. So the whole process got sped up. So as a result, I bet there was a bunch of true freshmen this fall camp whose heads were spinning, but because they weren't brought along slowly. They had to keep up with a very experienced group of players ahead of them. But for the team, that's a good thing. And I think they're better prepared for the start of the season than they were last year as a result.
I think you see that the sprinkling in of game prep stuff in the past, though, especially when you don't have that sort of dip your toe in the water game to start the season. Like if they open with an FCS team or something like that, then you don't really need to worry about that. But like the year Tech opened with Ohio State, they were doing Ohio State prep very early,
or even
in
UNC
the process.
a couple years ago.
I mean, they incorporate that kind of stuff. So I think it's who you play in that opener is a big factor with that. And while Vanderbilt is not top of the SEC, they're still in the SEC, still
right.
a Power 4 school. So I think that's a reason why you see some of that preseason prep where they get working with that a little bit earlier.
Yeah, we saw it last week at practice. Virginia Tech here and there is practice on the Marching Virginians turf field. To get acclimated for playing in the heat on a turf field that's what Tech's going to see in Nashville. Talking to somebody yesterday, the Hokies were supposed to do it again yesterday, but it just wasn't as hot. I think we got our first real taste of a little fall weather yesterday in Blacksburg. Kind of nice, a little cool today too. But the Hokies are doing stuff like that too, just to be mentally and physically ready for what they're going to experience in the elements, if that's what you want to call it. So that's obviously a component of that too.
All right, let's talk about this defense now. We had our offensive preview last week. Now we're talking about the defense. We got the lunch pail hoodie on, ready to roll. Want to break down some numbers for everybody before we get into our projected starters and kind of go position by position. This defense last year, 20th in the country in total defense, 57th in the country in rushing defense, 4th in the nation in passing defense, tied for 83rd in the country in total turnovers gained, something that they're going to look to kind of have an uptick here in 2024. 13th in the ACC in red zone defense, which was good for 107th in the country. 2nd in the ACC in sacks. 31st in the country in third down defense. So you have some huge positives there, don't get me wrong, but then you have some stuff that you definitely want to improve upon this season.
I think pass defense was really good and really consistent all year. I think whether or not you viewed Virginia Tech's rush defense as being good depends entirely on what game you watched. It's rare that you see that much of a swing where you're either getting completely dominated or you're completely dominating the opposition. I don't recall very many games where it was like an average rush defense performance, right? But so we gave up 120 yards this week.
That didn't happen a lot.
It was 250 or none, basically, is what it seemed like. So they've got to do a better job against those top opponents, like the most physical teams they play. And the first matchup they have that I think will really get a feel for how much more physical Virginia Tech is when they play Rutgers early in the season, and then Miami the next week. So we'll know by the end of the first month of the season whether this is a more physical team or not.
Well, I think that was a very good pass defense last year. It also didn't need to be challenged a lot because early in the season, teams would just run the ball all the time. So I think that factors into the final stats a little bit. But I still think it's a pretty strong group there, especially with the personnel they have. But it could be an interesting season with all the people coming back on that side of the ball. The continuity of coaching with Marv in his second year as the coordinator. Kind of surprised by the end of year stats. I didn't feel like that was a top 20 group. They performed like it. So, I'm not going to deny that they didn't perform like it, but it didn't feel like that certainly early in the season. And then they came along and played pretty good football. So, with everybody back, I think, could they make that leap into being one of the elite defenses this year? I think that'll be something interesting to see.
Let's talk about projected starters here. I'll kind of list who I have, and then you guys give your thoughts on that. You might agree across the board. You might have a couple of spots where you beg to differ. Starting on the defensive line, at the tackle spots, Aeneas Peebles, Josh Fuga. At the defensive end spots, Antoine Powell-Ryland, Cole Nelson. In the corners, Dorian Strong and Mansour Delane. Safeties, Mose Phillips and Jalen Stroman. I'm curious to get Chris's take, and we're going to kind of save that, Chris, but on exactly who's going to play free, who's going to play strong. And then for the linebackers, Jaden Keller at the will, Sam Brumfield at the mic, and then Keonta Jenkins at the star.
That sounds right. We could potentially see Keyshawn Burgos maybe beat out Cole Nelson for a starting spot, but in the end, they're going to play about the same number of snaps, so it doesn't matter. Whoever starts at the other defensive tackle spot, I guess that's probably up for debate a little bit too. Sure. I think Aeneas Peebles is gonna start. I think he's gonna be a dominant player this year, like absolutely dominant. But yeah, that all sounds right to me. And as far as those safeties goes, that was the starting group. I don't really I don't root for one player over another, but I thought that was the best outcome that you could have. I think when you look at the performances of Jalen Jones and Mose Phillips last year, they were both near the bottom when it comes to grades, but Phillips was ahead of him. He played the boundary role better than Jones played the free role last year, and he was only a true freshman to boot. He's a really high ceiling guy. Went through spring practice. I thought his game would take a stronger leap forward this year. And it sounds like that's the case. So that was the duo I was hoping for to start. Now, that being said, these days, Pry likes to rotate his safeties anyway. And then you've got targeting. And then Stroman's a guy who I think he only played 380 snaps last year because of injury. He's a guy who gets banged up a lot. So you're going to end up needing 4 safeties this year. For me, it's a question of who is the 4th safety? And I guess right now it's Quentin Reddish, it sounds like.
Possibly Reddish. It might be Mansour Delane. The way Pry said that he's sort of worked at both spots is keeping one foot in the safety room until those young guys are ready. And young guys, I look at Reddish, I look at Braylon Johnson, who Pry said long term is probably a safety. I think those guys are going to need to develop still. Probably a top 3 right now, and you rotate those 3, and Stroman gives you versatility by being able to play both. But I would guess Mansour is still a guy they would consider for that before maybe throwing Reddish into the fire, especially early in the year.
And man, Mansour did start at safety for the Pitt game last year, to remind everyone. So that is a possibility.
Chris, to your point, the 3rd oldest player only played 18 defensive snaps at the safety spot for the Hokies this year. 387 snaps last year for Jalen Stroman. How healthy do we think he is?
He was in limited contact jersey for one of the recent practices.
I think that's sort of his permanent practice jersey.
I think that I would bubble wrap
He seems to wear that all the time.
He was not yesterday. But.
He was not yesterday. I think for him, it's probably more of a precaution, and I would be more cautious with him because he's the only proven safety. It's one thing if one of your defensive tackles is banged up and you've got 4 others that are already proven, right? But for safety, he's a guy I think you really need to be healthy. He's not the best player on the team. He is very good when he's healthy. But as far as potential drop off, if he were to get hurt, I don't know that there's too many guys that are more important to this team than Stroman.
Do you like him better at the free or the strong, or you don't really care? Like you said, it depends who's with him.
I think he's got a really, really good head for the game. I think he made a play in the spring game a couple of years ago where I thought his acceleration and reading and break on the ball was exceptional. And to me, that generally plays a little better on the free safety side of the field. So I think for me, that's probably where I'd try to play him. But for him, it's all about who was gonna perform better, Jalen Jones at the free safety spot or Mose Phillips at the strong safety spot. That was going to determine where Jalen Stroman was going to start.
And Pry said yesterday after Wednesday's practice that Mose Phillips is playing the best in the boundary of anyone right now. So to me, that tells me he's the starter on the boundary, Stroman at the field. Jalen Jones has worked some at nickel as well and at cornerback. So if you have a guy that's working at two other spots in addition to safety, that tells me he's probably not your best safety option right now. So I would imagine that he's the third guy. If he goes in the game, Stroman goes to the boundary, and then they'll try to get Reddish up to speed in that group. And ideally, by the end of the year, have a full two deep that they can trust and rely back there.
Well, I had the safeties talked about last, and now we banged that out of the way.
Yeah, got it first.
Yeah. Let's go back to the top of the list and work in reverse order here. Let's talk about that defensive line. Lost 3 key tackles from a year ago, but obviously you reload out of the portal. You lose Feldarius Payne, who actually graded out as the 3rd best defensive lineman in the country, which is fascinating. Definitely curious to hear what you have to say about that, Chris. But you add Aeneas Peebles, who graded out as the 8th best defensive lineman in the nation. And then the Hokies they've dedicated nearly 25% of their total scholarships to the defensive line. So, Chris, to your point, they should be deep. Right? They
should be. I mean, when you're using 25% of your scholarships almost, then, yeah, you should have depth there. And I think J.C. Price has shown to be a pretty good player developer during the 4 years now I think he's been at Virginia Tech. I think that group goes 5 deep at end and tackle. And, depending on a guy like Curtis Perry, who's a redshirt sophomore and transferred in, maybe by the end of the year, you can conceivably say, oh, we're 6 deep at defensive tackle. And even Emmett Laws, who I think in most years would play as a true freshman. You just don't need him to this year because you just go out and recruit portal guys. So I think from maybe 1 through 7, this is the deepest group of defensive tackles that Virginia Tech has ever had. But you can't play 7 guys. It's hard enough to play 5. And keep everybody happy. So, but that's a good problem to have. I think it's a very deep group. I think at defensive tackle, you lose 3 seniors, one of which is in the NFL now. Payne, who was awesome last year, he plays for the Texans now. Whether he makes the final roster, we'll see. But certainly was a big impact player for the Hokies last season. You lose those 3 seniors, and you can go out and replace them with a redshirt senior, redshirt junior, and redshirt junior, right? So that's just the way modern college football is. It gives you an opportunity to reload. I think Virginia Tech is still a program that does that they want to develop players over time. But when they have a glaring hole like that, you can go out and fill it, and that's what they've done. And I think that group will be a strength this year, especially Peoples, who I think that first team All ACC pick for him is probably going to turn out to be a very wise pick.
Yeah, and you always need depth there, because that's a position that gets banged around, and there's always something. You're always dealing with something, like a leg or an ankle gets rolled up on the interior there. So to have some depth, I think, is critical. I probably feel best about the top 3 at tackle with Peebles and Fuga. I would imagine the starting duo. Copeland, weight room beast, and everybody's really excited about him. He still never played at this level, so right. Junior college level, I guess. He was a little bit at Army. As a freshman, did he play much? I can't remember.
Not really.
He played much.
No.
Very little.
His body was changing. They recruited him as a linebacker.
Right. So this is sort of his introduction to this level, which is why I think, coming off the bench initially, and then having a guy with that sort of athletic skills off the bench is always a great thing too. I think it's that 3rd and 4th spots. Like Gilliam, still got to see a bit more. I don't think he really stood out in the spring too much at that spot. Panay has been around for a while. It's certainly a veteran who's played a lot of snaps, but I feel a lot better about those top 3 than I do maybe about 4 and 5. And then, you mentioned Laws. He's gotten in some of these rotations early in practice, not with the starters, but, getting there in the second group or the third group. Will be interesting to see if they would use a guy like that. Because, typically you'd want to redshirt that guy. Mm-hmm. And that's a position where size and strength and experience matters quite a bit. So if you can get a 5th-year guy there rather than a 4th-year guy by the end of his career, that would be very beneficial. So I think the hope would be to redshirt Laws there, but we'll see how injuries and things play out.
I think there's still so much competition there. Like when David and I were watching the defensive linemen in a drill yesterday, Panay at one point was actually running with the first team defensive tackles. So I think, and I don't think he's not gonna end up starting, in my opinion, but maybe he was better than the other guys the day before. So his reward, he was with the starting group yesterday, and I think that type of competition is great. That's exactly what you need in a room, and I think it elevates the performance of everybody, because you have to bring it every day, because somebody will take your spot if you don't.
Well, the beauty too of the whole redshirt thing is Emmett Laws could still appear in 4 games, as we know, and then still redshirt.
Mm-hmm.
But I do agree with you, Andy. It'd be better to have him for that one extra year, especially if you're the deepest you've ever been. Like of all the years to redshirt that guy, it's this year.
Absolutely, and you have to think about it like this: would you rather have him for 50 snaps as a true freshman, or 450 snaps as a redshirt senior? What's going to benefit this program the most? I think the answer is obvious.
No doubt about it. All right, well, let's talk about our man Antoine Powell-Ryland. Let's talk about these edge rushers. This is a group compiled of all juniors and seniors, the edge rushers. Top 5 guys have combined for over 3,000 snaps as a unit. APR, third best pass rush grade in the ACC, behind just Jared Verse, who is a draft pick in the NFL, and then Aeneas Peebles, who's now his teammate. Finished with 9.5 sacks, 14.5 tackles for loss. But again, the knock, so to speak, on APR, 4 of those sacks came against Wake Forest. He had 3 2+ sack performances, but then 7 games where he did not register a sack. So maybe you'd like to see that spread the wealth a little bit this season.
Yeah, spread the wealth. I guess it was 8 of the 9.5 came in 3 games. Yeah, so spread it out a little bit. Some of that is not really his fault. Like, he didn't really have a chance to get a sack against Louisville, because Louisville never threw the ball that game because they were just running it down Tech's throats the whole time. So if Tech can be better at stopping the run and getting teams in more 3rd and 8 situations, then there will be an opportunity for more sacks, not just for him, but for everybody. So, complementary football, as some coaches would call that.
Well, it's that Wake Forest game. He just teed off in the 4th quarter because they had to drop back and pass every time. And I think he's still kind of angry. He had to share one of those sacks against UVA. He thought he had 10, and then I think Cole Nelson got in at the very end of that and shared a sack. So, still one of my favorite stats to cite about Virginia Tech is the last guy who had double-digit sacks in the season was Darryl Tapp in 2005. So it's been a while. I mean, you talk about Saxburg and all the great defensive ends that they've had come through here. And, I think Daddy Nicholas had like 9.5. Kenny Canham had 9 or 9.5. They were really close to getting there, but it's been a while since they've had a guy that just put up a monster season like that in terms of sacks. So we'll be interesting to see if he gets hit double digits.
Yeah, and that's a long time ago now in football terms, 2005.
It was a long time ago, period. We're talking about almost 2 decades.
That was my first year out of college. God. I mean, it's so, yeah, and you think about...
And you're old, man.
I know,
so
exactly.
That's been a while.
Were you surprised to not see APR on the All-ACC preseason? Not that it matters that much.
There's a lot of good defensive ends, I think. I think that was one of the positions you're going through, and you're like, there's just a lot of good players here. And some of them are like, you classify them as tackles or ends.
Sure.
And, that Gelati guy coming back from
Louisville.
Louisville,
Really
he's
good.
pretty good.
He's a freak.
So it's just, sometimes you get squeezed out at those positions. So not too surprising.
There's 17 teams in this league this now, right? It's
Usually,
hard to be a first-team all-conference player. Like when Virginia Tech was in the Big East back in the day, there were 8 teams in the Big East. It's a lot easier to be a first-team all-conference player then. And even when they first joined the ACC, that first year it was 11 teams. And then after that it was 12. But now there's just so many teams that like, I don't think you can put too much stock. And not only is it like more competition, but now there's also more voters.
Sure.
There's more variety of opinion and things like that. So I don't think you can put too much stock in the preseason stuff. It's like the watch list for position.
Well, I even stopped worrying about watch lists.
Right.
Usually they do them in July when there's nothing else going on. I'm
Right.
like, well, I might as well at least address this watch list stuff. But this year they did it in August. I'm like, there's actual stuff to report on now.
Right. Yeah.
Useless watch list.
It's useless. So you're telling me if a running back who wasn't on a watch list came out of nowhere and rushed for 2,000 yards that he wouldn't win the Doak Walker because he
Also,
wouldn't want to.
There was one of the positions that might have been running back with like 15 ACC teams had a guy on there.
Right.
It's like, Well, how much of a honor is this? If
Why don't we just watch everybody? How about
list
that?
the starting running back from every single team. It's not that special.
Pete Thamel said something the other day on the College Game Day podcast talking about how now 17 teams in the league, and he's like, this is not going to stay this way for very long. He's like, if I'm SMU, I would not get the ACC standings tattooed on myself,
No.
So we'll see how it all shakes out. Let's talk a little bit about Cole Nelson, though. Cole Nelson graded out better against the run than in the pass last year. Finished with 4.5 sacks, but expecting him to have a big year this year.
I think I've always maintained that Cole Nelson is the modern Nikos Brown. That's who he reminds me of the most. He's not like a dynamic pass rusher, but he's a good, solid one-gap player. And all those, big chunks of yardage at times that Virginia Tech gave up last year, you could rarely ever point to a play and say, Cole Nelson didn't secure his gap properly on that play. He's one of those guys. If you had 11 Cole Nelsons on the field, nobody would be a star, but you'd be a really good defense because everybody would do his job on pretty much every play. So he's a solid guy across the board.
You would have thought after the spring game, the way Burgos played, that he's going to displace Nelson in that spot. But, Cole Nelson came on strong at the end of last year. I think he's had a great offseason. The coaches have raved about his leadership. He was just voted a team captain. I think he's done everything that they've wanted him to and is pretty entrenched in that starting spot. So, I think you always look at bigger, faster, stronger, and that's what Burgos is in this situation. But Nelson is, the more mature player in terms of experience, and brings that leadership quality. He was the keeper of the pale earlier this month. I don't know if he still is or if he's passed that on to somebody else, but that's a pretty important thing for this defense. So a very good emotional and just leader for this team.
Andy mentioned his leadership. I think that's big. We've seen last year, Josh Fugo was one of the captains, and I guess they rotate some of the captains, or I would assume they rotate some of the captains around. But Andy, you mentioned the spring game, and I think what some people might forget is that Cole Nelson had what looked like a really, really bad injury in the spring game.
Well, that was McCray.
That was McCray, right?
CJ McCray.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Nelson, he had four sacks in the final 5 games last year. He came on strong. He's a guy who kind of played his best football at the end of the year. He got one in the against UVA that might have been APRs that they shared, but he's a guy who, like Chris said, has always been really consistent, and I think he complements APR well. People aren't going to talk about him a lot. But he's a leader. He's a captain. We saw him when Keyshawn Burgos got kicked out of practice. He went over and was the guy that was talking him down. He kind of plays a crucial part on this defensive line, and I'm curious to see what kind of season he can have, because if he can keep up his production and kind of start hot like he ended the season hot last year, Tech's going to be really, really solid that spot.
Yeah, he was probably telling him, man, you're not going to take my starting spot if you keep getting kicked out of practice, right? But those defensive ends, it's interesting. You look at the top 5, and Tech will play 5 most likely to a certain extent. And they're all between 251 and 253 pounds, and all between 6'3 and 6'5. You talk about a template. When you've had the same defensive line coach in place for 4 years and the same strength and conditioning coach in place for 3 years, and you've got a cohesive plan in place, then a lot of your players are going to kind of look the same. And that's kind of what this group of defensive ends are, man. I'm telling you, maybe the most physical, I think the best looking guys physically are Burgos and CJ McCray. And neither one of them are going to start most likely. But that group across the board, Jordan McDonald too, he looks the part. But that whole group, they're just it's all seniors and juniors. And I think as a group, obviously APR's, the best of them all, but I think overall as a group, it's going to grow this year.
So my question for you is, Andy and Chris and David, what does improvement in this unit look like this year? Because they were pretty good already last year.
Yeah, I think you'll know it when you see it. I think you'll see more plays. Not necessarily, it may or may not show up in sacks and tackles for loss, but just stuffing plays around the line of scrimmage and things like that, and just making things difficult for running backs, and maybe making things a little bit easier for safeties, because Tech runs a one-gap scheme, so if one safety's out of position, then, it's a big play for a touchdown. We saw that so many times last year, but at the same time, if there's a little bit more penetration, it covers up for some mistakes on the back end. So, a little more penetration, I would say, overall.
Yeah, I'd say that and doing it against better competition. Don't just beat up on Wake Forest and Pitt when their quarterbacks can't do anything back there. Get to the quarterback against Louisville or Florida State or NC State. That's when they need to really show up, is in the big games, and prove that they can do it against any level of competition.
Yeah, you've got a super deep room. Sorry, I said Nelson earlier. McCray's the guy who it looked like he was going to be out. The fact that he is back is huge. You combine him with Burgos, who had a big spring game. But yeah, I think consistency across the board, five sacks last year came against Old Dominion, 7 against Wake Forest, 8 against Syracuse, and 6 against Virginia. And then Tech, the only other game Tech had more than 2 in was Pitt. It's like when you're playing teams like Florida State and Louisville and NC State, Tech had 4 total sacks in those 3 games. It's like if Tech can get pressure against Rutgers, against Miami at the end of September, I think this group you will see that it is better. But when the Hokies come out and they get 5 sacks against Old Dominion again, it's like, okay, well, that's expected, I think, with this group and the level of caliber players that are coming back.
Feels like we pretty much already hammered home the interior defensive line, so I'll just tee it up. Aeneas Peebles, new big man on campus, 3rd team All-ACC last season at Duke, preseason All-ACC this year, maybe what he brings to the table, and then if you had anything else you wanted to say on Fuga, Copeland, Gilliam, or anybody else.
I think Eric McLean came on the podcast and called Peebles a war daddy. And I think that's a really good description. And that's what I'll start calling him. But I think he's going to have a great year. I don't know if anybody else will be more than solid. But when you have 1 great player and 4 solid ones, that's going to be a really, really good group. So I do agree with Andy that, probably the 4th and 5th guys, we need to see it a little bit more on the field before we know for sure. But overall, I've heard through the grapevine that J.C. Price feels like this is a better defensive line than he had last year, and last year's was pretty good on the whole. So if he's right, and I'm sure that he is, then I feel good about it. That's probably, besides wide receivers, probably the least of my concern going into the first game.
Well, I've not seen a transfer come in and receive more universal praise than Peebles. There's not a single, not that people are disparaging guys when you talk to them anyway, but everybody you talk to is just perfect fit, mature, goes to work, just what they needed. Prize raves about him and what he can do in the defense, just schematically how he fits this group. I just think, you always wonder what you're going to get in the transfer portal. Are you getting somebody else's problem? Is there something you don't know about this guy? Why is he transferring in the first place? And there's been none of that with Peebles. He's just come in and it's just nope, he's the starter. He's the guy. He's the dude on defense. I mean, spring defensive MVP, preseason All-ACC. It's man, how did Duke let this guy go? I know they had a new coach coming in, but I'd make that the highest of high priority to try to keep a guy like that. And the fact that, Tech pried him away from somebody else in the ACC, I mean, it's pretty impressive.
I'm interested to see Gilliam, Copeland, and Penne, that group, right? What is their impact? Are they consistent? Because we know what Virginia Tech is getting in Peebles and Fuga. Those 2 guys have been proven at the college level. But Andy said it. Copeland's a JUCO guy, recruited originally as a linebacker, as Chris mentioned. This is his first taste of ACC football. Same with Copeland. Same with Gilliam. He's coming from Oklahoma, so he's gotten the sense, I think, a little bit more of what the level is like. But can those guys produce when they're in the game? If we see, J.C. Price rotate those guys in and those guys are producing, that is a really good sign. I think they'll be good, but I think if the saying, your ceiling is always kind of determined by your weakest link, right? I think of that group, Like when you've got a guy pulling like Peebles and the guy's consistent like Fuga, I think that's really, really good. I'm curious what happened at the bottom, you know, with if Curtis Perry plays at all, what Wilfred Panay can do if he's, you know, repping with the ones like we saw yesterday. What can he do this season? If those guys, you know, 2, 3, or 3, 4, 5, 6, if those guys can get in and have an impact, that'll be really, really good.
Let's talk about the linebackers a little bit here. We got the Will, the Mike, the Star, Jaden Keller at the Will. Sam Brumfield came in to play the Mike. He particularly graded out very well against big teams, Alabama, Missouri last year on the schedule for him. And then Keonta Jenkins at the Star. Andy and Chris, kind of break it down for us.
I think Brumfield brings a solidity to the Mike position that they did not have last year. I mean, that was their combo. They had to play 2 players there that are just not Mikes in any way, shape, or form. Brumfield is a natural inside linebacker with a lot of reps under his belt. He's played well against a couple of big name teams. He'll bring more instincts, a heavier shoulder, better tackler. You know, there's some questions about how he'll do against the pass, but you know, after last year, I think the primary focus of any middle linebacker, I don't care what era of football you're talking about. Maybe things will be different in 20 years, but the primary, you have to be good at stopping the run if you're a middle linebacker. You can't be on the field if you're not.
Right.
Unless there's just no other options. And I think he's very good at that, and I think we'll see a big improvement there. Keller, I'm happy that he's not playing Mike anymore because he's been such a young player. Like, he didn't play that much defense in high school, and when he did, it was as a safety, and now you're talking about moving him to inside linebacker. And you're playing him at Mike where he's got to call out defensive signals for the whole defense and get other people lined up and things like that. So his mind is already tying up his feet as it is. And then you add that extra responsibility on his shoulders, and it made him even worse. So I think he's in a position now at Will where he can play a little bit more freedom. And now going into his 4th year of the program, you know, he should be ready. You know, he should be ready to take that step. So I would project improvement there as well, and you kind of know what you're getting with Keonta Jenkins. The big question is, like, who's going to play in the backup roles? Is Kelly Lawson legitimately a star now, right? Are we going to see him more on the wide side of the field, which I've always been in favor of? And then you've got Jaden McDonald, who was very good down the stretch last year at the Will spot, now is backing up at Mike. Pry's going to rotate, like he's going to play, or we're going to see him some at Will and see him some at Mike. We don't know. But overall, I do feel like this group is going to be stronger this year. If it's not, then Tech will have to reevaluate what they're doing with their linebackers, I think. But you know, I feel much better about the group right now than I did last year.
Yeah, it's a better group. It is still what I would consider the biggest question mark on this defense, those inside linebacker spots. And if those aren't solidified, as we saw last year, they can be problematic, especially in the run game and stopping that. And if you can't stop the run, then you can't really play defense. So, yeah, I feel better about this group with Brumfield coming in. I'm curious about that Will spot. You know, we've heard it about Keller before, right? Things are starting to make sense, starting to click for him, and that just doesn't in the game. So will be interesting to see that. But if they don't, if it doesn't work out for him there, they do have other options. You know, I think Lawson is still sort of, can go between those 2 spots. I think they really like Woodson. And Pry has said his long-term home probably at Will, maybe at Mike eventually. We talked to a couple guys last week. This like high motor is what you hear about him all the time. Just doesn't stop when he's on the field, which you like that out of your linebackers. You hear that out of a Mike linebacker quite a bit. So, we'll see where he eventually ends up. But I think there are more options at that spot. They certainly rotate them enough at practice that they should know more than one spot. So I think the play will be improved there, but how much improved they are, I think will tell the tale of this defense.
Who do you think is going to have the comm device on this defense? Is it going to be one of the linebackers? You'd have to think one of the linebackers.
Certainly Brumfield.
Yeah,
that's the guy who makes all the calls, and he's the quarterback of the defense. So I can't imagine anybody else would.
All right, perfect. You kind of answered every question I had about the linebackers. I was going to add, Chris, do you think it's the biggest question mark, or is it the safeties?
That's a good question. I think once I feel pretty good now about Tech starting safeties. That was the duo that I thought would be the best fit together. It's when they start rotating safeties, then I think the safeties, like if the two backup safeties are in the game, then I think the safeties will be the biggest question mark. But if the two starters are in there, then yeah, you maybe look at the linebackers and say, okay, is Jaden Keller ready to take the next step? Because I agree, like it's one of those things. It's like I have a feeling that he's going to be better, but I don't know it. It would not surprise me if you go out there and you're just like, another preseason of hype, and here we are again. But like Andy said, the good thing is I think there are options. Like if for some reason none of those guys work out at will, you can just move McDonald right back there where he was a pretty effective player down the stretch.
Yeah, I think generally the middle of the defense, those inside linebacker spots, the safeties, how are you playing between the hashes there? And that was the tail of the defense last year. Is when they didn't play well and people were running for 300 yards against them, that was a problem. And when they did play well and they shut everything down up the middle, then they were a really good defense. So we'll see how it plays out.
As always, Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company. As our presenting sponsor, First Bank and Trust Company's support has been invaluable to TSL, helping us to bring you all the great content across all of our platforms. They offer a variety of checking and saving account options that are sure to meet your banking needs, including free checking. Visit firstbank.com to find the account that's right for you. All right, last but not least, let's talk about the cornerbacks here, and then we're going to touch on the special teams unit a little bit as well. Listing them through: Dorian Strong, Mansour Delane, Dante Lovett, Braylon Johnson, Jonathan Penix, Christian Williams, Thomas Williams, and Joshua Clark. Is Mansour Delane and Dorian Strong one of the top corner doers, not just in the ACC, but in the entire country?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can. I think there's no question about that. Now they weren't they weren't challenged all that much last year. Tech didn't face that many great quarterbacks last year, but I mean Dorian Strong's numbers are what they are. What did they complete? 9 passes on him? Was that it?
It was something
like for
ridiculous.
40 yards or
it was
80,
like
60 yards.
It was like Caleb Farley in 2019 numbers.
Yeah, it was
that's
something
what
that seems like you're playing on JV level on NCAA football. I mean, it was legitimately that dominant. So you can't ignore those numbers. And I think having 2 great cornerbacks like that, it really helps a defensive coordinator scheme, knowing that the other team's not going to be able to throw the ball outside the hash marks. It just makes your job so much easier.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't studied all the different cornerback tandems in the ACC, but just based on what I know about this group, it's got to be up there.
Sure.
I mean, it's proven for a couple years now, and I think Delane last year wasn't as good as his freshman year, although his freshman year was very short, very strong for a short number of games. So you're talking about a longer haul, which is more difficult, but strong for a couple years now has been like a dude on that defense. He got injured a couple times, which held him back, but his season was so strong last year. I saw an NFL ranking, like top 50 prospects the other day, and Mansour was number 31.
Wow.
So we're talking about a guy that has pretty high draft stock here, that if he can have a big season, could hear his name pretty early in the draft next spring if he decides to go. So when that's the other guy that you have to go with, Dorian Strong, that's a pretty good top 2. Now the questions get beyond that. It's like who's number 3 and 4 when they have to go in the game there. But man, I don't think you want to take those 2 off the field very much.
Yeah, I agree. I think Tech would be fine with Lovett. I'm very high on Lovett. He played well in limited action last year. I think he's got excellent size. Comes from DeMatha, which produces so many good players. It's funny how there are so many more NFL scouts at Tech's practices these years.
More. Well, I mean, last year when we did we were at the pro day, a pretty light pro day.
Yeah.
And not too many scouts there. And it was going quick. I saw Pry, and I'm like, I like this. Short and sweet. He's like, wait until next year. Mm-hmm. He knew what they had coming back and the type of roster they'd have, and it would generate some NFL interest. So this year's pro day, or next in February or March, whenever they do it, it's going to be a little bit longer, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. And,
good problem to have.
And a lot of those guys are there to see those 2 cornerbacks, but certainly plenty of other players as well. Thomas Williams seems like is a guy who's made the biggest jump.
Yeah, and I always confuse him and Christian Williams. I don't think we've ever spoken to either of them, so I can't really put a face to either of them. too much. But Brent Pry said the other day there might not be a more improved player on the roster than Thomas Williams, who was hurt last fall. And then, I think he played a lot of running back in high school. So cornerback is still somewhat new to him in terms of the number of reps, but, got beat a couple times in the spring, but Price said he just got up, went back to work, and just kind of had a short memory with that whole thing, which is exactly what you need from a cornerback. That's the mentality you need to have. So perhaps Dante Lovett and Thomas Williams emerging as those second guys there at cornerback. I don't know. Jalen Jones has practiced there as well. Braylon Johnson, played quite a bit last year for a true freshman. I think they still have to sort that out, because you don't want to, have a significant dropout when Dorian or Mansour needs to take a break out there. So I think that's something they're still figuring out here in the late in camp, I guess.
Yeah. So Thomas Williams is from South Carolina. Christian Williams is from Richmond.
They were both hurt at some point last year, and they're both named Williams,
and both were like, "Oh, are they going to play corner or safety?"
Right.
Yeah.
Well, if it helps at all, Thomas wears 23 and Christian wears number 30. For Hokies fans, they're going to have their eyes peeled.
That does not help at all.
9 days.
I think one of them has to go by their first name only, like they're a Brazilian soccer star or something like that.
I
like that.
Christian. I think that,
So we'll just call it.
Yeah,
Christian.
there you go. That's better. The other could be Williams and then Christian.
Well, poor Nick, you can't even sometimes in practice put name to numbers, because poor Nick was over here trying to log all the photos that Ivan and John take at practice, and the scout team's wearing different numbers, and Nick's like, well, that's not Bashal Tootin, so I don't know what I'm doing.
They're like, Dante Lovett is all over the field. It's like, well, they have a guy wearing 1 on the scout team too that's playing cornerback that is making some of those plays.
Yeah, definitely interesting. What about Braylon Johnson? Could he play a little bit of free safety? What do we like about him as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's got a good head for the game. He's one of those guys. He came in so skinny, and they tried to play him last year, and I bet if they had it to do over again, they wouldn't. Like, I remember him getting the game as a corner against Purdue, and his angle was right. He was there. He read the play correctly. He just wasn't big enough and strong enough to bring down the ball carrier, and it ended up being a big gain, and Purdue scored and won the game. And after that, his playing time, dropped off. And I bet they wish they had redshirted him so he could get some more weight room time and put another year on the end of his career. Because right now he's not in the 2 deep at either spot, but he's a true sophomore. So you're talking about next year he would be a junior and still hasn't been in the 2 deep, right? So that would almost seem like a wasted first 2 years where you didn't use one of those years as a redshirt year. And he's not the type of guy who you really see as a special teams player. But like last year, he played a few more defensive snaps than Dante Lovett, but he didn't play very many special team snaps because special teams are about head-on collisions at full speed, and he's not big enough to handle that. So I would, if he's not in the 2 deep at either one of those spots, but you still think he has a long-term future, hit the button, Nick. There you go. Just because he's a sophomore. Plenty. Chiron Stith redshirted as a sophomore.
Ricky Walker.
Yeah, exactly.
I think Pry mentioned that the other day. It's like there are guys that have played before that still have redshirt possibilities. Tucker Holloway being one that injured right now for obvious reasons. Why you think about the redshirt there, but Pry he keeps bringing up. He's practiced in both corner and safety. I think long term he's probably more of a safety. Whenever the head coach is saying something like that, when he's like Caleb Woodson, I think he's more of a will. It's like, okay, he's going to be a will linebacker. If the head coach thinks that's the direction they're going to go eventually. If the guy sticks around in the program, which I imagine Braylon Johnson, given his family's history here, would. So I think he's probably a safety long term if they're already talking about that a little bit. And if he's not in that top 4 this year, like you said, I think you consider redshirting him. Get him in for those 4 games. Give him another year to develop. You're going to have, major turnover in the secondary after this year, probably anyway. Dorian being a senior, Stroman being a senior, Mansour, I think, has got to be thinking about the NFL at this point. So there's going to be spots available next year. So if you can give him another year to develop, save a year on the back end of his career, I think you probably have to do that.
He's another guy I think at some point could be an excellent nickel for Virginia Tech because he would bring cornerback skills and safety skills to that position. So that's something to keep your eye on. I mean, I would redshirt him this year if I felt like I could, but and then next year, obviously, like Andy said, there's going to be a lot of spots open, including that nickel role. And if he's not quite ready to start at corner if Tech feels like they're good at safety with like Quentin Reddish and Mose Phillips, then that's a role for him where he could get a lot of playing time, continue to develop skills at both positions, and then you figure out later, where he can help you full time.
Defense as a whole, do we think this is a, let's call it, top 3 unit in the conference? And they were 20th in the nation last year, so let's call it top 12 unit in the nation. I mean, I know it's a high bar, but you bring back and you add on. That's a recipe for improvement.
Yeah, I think it has the potential to be. I say that not having studied the other ACC defenses, and then every year is a different challenge. It seems like the Hokies have a favorable schedule this year, but who knows? Who knows how some of the Rutgers just lost their star linebacker to a torn ACL, so maybe they're not going to be as strong as people thought because one of their best players is hurt. Likewise, maybe a team that doesn't seem so strong right now, you get into the season and you realize they're better than they are. It could even be your Syracuse Orange there, Gio. You never know.
Oh, you're trying to get me in trouble,
I
Chris.
know, I'm trying to. But I do think they have that potential. I don't think we're going to see so many ups and downs this year. I don't think you're going to go from, this week you're giving up 300 rushing yards and next week you gave up 12, right? I think things are going to be a little more balanced, a little more streamlined. How that shows up in the overall numbers, I don't know. But I think the eye test at the end of the year, my guess is you'll say, yes, that was a better defense than last year's.
Well, do you know where they finished in the conference last year? Don't look it up. Do you know off the top of your head where they finished in the conference last year?
I'm going to say
I do
fourth.
not.
They were second.
Really?
In total yards per game, 316.8. Only Clemson was better. Now it's tight. Louisville right behind them, Miami, Florida State, everybody kind of all in the mix there. So, could they finish top 3? Sure, because they did last year. And I think they're a better defense than they were last year. Will they? Who knows? I think schedule is a big part of that. They don't play a lot of high-powered offenses this year, I don't think. Clemson is obviously one of the marquee games, and that's not an offensive
They're
powerhouse.
a defensive team, yeah.
Miami, probably one of the bigger challenges on that front. I don't think anybody in the non-conference really jumps out at you. So Georgia Tech might be one of the better offenses they play this year.
Yeah.
But I think just the personnel they have coming back, the experience they have coming back, coordinator in his second year calling plays, everything points to an improvement on that side of the ball.
Definitely a lot to be excited about. Let's break down the special teams real quick before we let everybody go. Kyle Lowe, your kickoff specialist, 54 touchbacks last season on 78 kickoffs. Always good when you can just get it out of the back of the end zone. Punter Peter Moore put 21 punts inside the 20 on 60 attempts last season. You'd have to think your place kicker will be John Love once again. He was 20 for 22 last year, a long of 47. 6 of 7 from between 40 and 49 yards. He did not attempt a 50-plus yarder last year. So let's talk about the returners. Kick returner, Tootin and Thomas once again. I mean, obviously, Bashal Tootin. You think Thomas will be lined up back there with him?
I would think so. And you've got other options, but most kickoff return coaches prefer running backs because a kickoff return is like a running play. You're following blocks. There are designs. There are counters. There are traps. There are ISOs. Things like that.
Well, especially Stu Holt, who was the running backs coach previously.
Exactly.
He knows those guys in and out.
Exactly right. So, yeah, I would expect it to be those two guys.
All right, punt returner. This is where you have the slightest question mark. Let's say Tucker Holloway's not going to play this year.
Yeah.
You got to think probably Jalen Lane, and then who do you put in there as well? Because Lane had 5 returns for 31 yards last year. Holloway had 21 returns for 258 yards. He had a long of 66. Lane's longest was just 14 yards. You'd have to think Lane's not going to take, every single punt the entire season. So who else would you put back there?
Well, they've worked Jennings there. Yep. They've worked Takai Heath, Xavier, Turner Bradshaw. I think those are 4 guys who could be possibilities. I mean, you say Lane only had 5 returns or whatever its average was. They had 1 called back. He had a touchdown against BC. They got called back. And in 2021, he was 4th in the country in punt returns in Middle Tennessee. So it stinks that Holloway is hurt because he was such a weapon back there as a punt returner. But Lane is pretty dang good at that job. I don't think there's going to be much reason to take him off the field unless he needs a breather or something like that, or if he gets dinged up in any way.
I agree with all that. I'd be intrigued to see what Heath could do there because so many older Virginia Tech players, when I asked them at Media Day to name standout young players, so many of them named Heath as their number one guy on offense, and they talked about what he can do in the open field. And obviously we know what Turner Bradshaw can do in the open field, like we saw against NC State last year. So, like, I do think, those first 3 games for Virginia Tech, I think Virginia Tech is going to win those games with relative ease, and there's going to be opportunities in the fourth quarter to see what some of these younger guys can do. So I think we'll see at least one of those guys return a punt or two early in the season. And that'll give us a glimpse into the future of punt returner.
That is the Chris Coleman kiss of death right there. My goodness. Tempting the football gods like that.
Somebody asked on the boards yesterday, they were checking in, hey, do we have any injuries? I was like, I'm going to really regret saying this, but we have a clean bill of health.
Oh, boy.
Now. This is a really healthy football team. And, but it is. What are you supposed to say? What else are you supposed to say?
Sure. David, checking in with you one last time.
Yeah, I think the special teams is interesting because everybody focuses on offense and defense, but it was something when we talked to Pry at the beginning of camp. He's like, yeah, man, like we've got everybody back. I talked to Dorian Strong, and he's a guy who's worn 25 in his career, I believe, and he plays on the special teams units, and they've got not everybody, but a bunch of those guys back. Guys who are on the punt team or on the kickoff team, along with all the specialists. You've got Kyle Lowe, you've got John Love, you've got Peter Moore back, you've got your long snapper back. So that is a unit that at times could make or break a game or swing the momentum in your favor. Everybody knows Virginia Tech has prided itself on special teams for the longest time, Beamer ball. I think John Love was excellent last year as a true freshman. He's only going to get better. Peter Moore, I thought had a really good year after 22 being a little hit or miss, a little inconsistent. I thought he was really good last year. And Kyle Lowe, you mentioned it, Gio. Touchbacks after touchbacks after touchbacks. If Hokies can be really good on special teams, that just elevates their chances when they get into big-time games against teams like Miami or Clemson, where one play can make all the difference, right? Bashal Tootin. We saw it last year a couple times. He can house one. I know they don't have Tucker Holloway, but we saw Jalen Lane. He has that capability. So they've got a lot of talent there. Don't overlook special teams. That is a position where Virginia Tech could change some games this year.
Agreed, and it's more than just returns. I mean, Tech was solid across the board on special teams last year, with the exception of the kickoff return they gave up against Wake Forest. They outplayed pretty much everybody they faced on special teams last season. And, don't overlook like the old triple option with Peter Moore to John Love. Those two guys are capable of pulling that off.
And don't forget about what Virginia Tech pulled against Wake Forest last year. I believe it was Wake with Cole Nelson.
Yeah, the fake
punt.
Yeah,
that's right.
Stu Holt and they've shown that they are willing to gamble a little bit on special teams. So, and I think it helps when, like, if your defense is showing you can play, they're playing consistently. You're not maybe worried as much about going for it and putting them in a tighter spot. So it all goes together. Special teams is obviously that third piece of the puzzle, but I'm excited about that group because they're consistent, right? If you have a kicker who every time he lines up has a chance to make it, like, you're in a good spot. Not every single team can say that.
9 days from kick, what's coming up on TSL this week?
My last preview articles today on the quarterbacks. I intentionally left it for last because it's the quarterbacks. Plus, I wanted to see if they would name a backup quarterback, which they have.
There you
go. Normal Q&A tomorrow. Top prospects on Monday, and then we get into game week.
Depth chart projection. I know we just talked about it through this whole thing, but if you want it in the written form, that'll be posted here shortly. Actually, probably before this podcast gets up.
Awesome. For you, David?
Yeah, it's almost a game week. So next week, game week will look like, I assume, going off of what last year was, we'll talk to Pry on Tuesday. We'll have practice on Wednesday. We'll talk to some coaches and some players. Chris, of course, will have his preview. We'll have 2 podcasts.
Just one podcast next week because we don't have a game to talk about.
Okay.
So we're gonna do a Wednesday preview pod, right, Nick?
Right.
Yes. All right.
But there'll be plenty of stuff, and then Andy and I are heading down to Nashville. So yeah, football season's here. We got week 0 this week.
Florida State, Georgia Tech. Gonna be a good game to watch, no doubt about it. Well, appreciate you guys. Looking forward to the football season being here. Looking forward to next week, and I think that brings it to a close today. For Jim McAllister hanging out with us from First Bank and Trust Company, thank you so much to them for sponsoring the show. For Nick Brown, for David Cunningham, Andy Bitter, Chris Coleman, I'm Giovanni Heater saying so long. This was episode 369 of the Tech Sideline podcast. We'll see you next week.